Welcome. I'm Ann Silverthorne, and this presentation is about William E. Dimorier, forgotten educator and servant leader. My goal is for you to find value in learning about this ordinary and extraordinary man. First, let's start with a couple of questions. Have you ever felt insignificant? Have you ever felt like Sisyphus from Greek mythology, pushing a boulder up a hill over and over, only to have it roll back down again and again? Well, I learned from William Dimorier that none of us is insignificant, and there is much more to life than that wretched rock. Here's a roadmap of where we're headed in this presentation. This will be a broad survey of William E. Dimorier's life as a servant leader. It's based on a 440-page manuscript I wrote about his life. First, I'll tell you how this project all got started in 2004. Then we'll take a look at William's early life in upstate New York and his interesting educational path. His move to Pennsylvania and accomplishments at Erie High, also known as Central, his contributions while at Academy High, his productivity and creativity during his second act, and then finally, the legacy that he left. There are many rich dimensions to Dimorier's life, including his leadership qualities, which we'll focus on here, his sports enthusiasm, his role in education, his love of music and stewardship of music programs, and his views toward all of this and life in general through his original poetry compositions. Here's how I became acquainted with William E. Dimorier. In May 2004, I was working as Gannon University's grant writer, and one morning my colleague, Carol Perry, asked me if I'd like to walk to an auction preview with her at lunchtime. She'd heard that there'd be prints of her Uncle Joseph Plavkin's paintings for sale. So four of us from Gannon walked to 11th Street and entered the ivy-draped brick building, which was AKD Printing. While the other three looked for the Plavkin prints, I started wandering among the rows of inventory. A stack of old books caught my eye, and at the top of the pile sat a moss-green journal, about 5 inches by 9 inches in size. I opened it and saw that someone had written, "This book belongs to W.E." I couldn't make out the last name. It also offered a reward, so I knew it must have been important to its owner. Inside, I found poem after poem, handwritten in ink. They explored a wide variety of subjects, including the wind and the sea. Because some of the poems appeared in several versions, I knew they were originals. One in particular appealed to me because of its use of literary devices, classical references, and an unusual topic. Steel. I am steel, hardiest of the metal clan, born in the furnace and nurtured in the forge. I bend, recoil, stand firm, possess a soul and character and will. I fight on every battlefield, in cannon, sword, and armor shield. I write Magna Cartas, indite the poet's dream, and ply the silken thread through every seam. I steady ships on misty seas, I am the woodman's axe to fell the trees. I mark the hours on the dial, as Chronos sits and nods the while. I hold the modern babbles high, when angry Aeolus is sweeping by. My eye is ever toward the pole, I am the symbol of the soul. Some of the other poems in the journal bore dates under them, with the oldest being 1937, nearly 70 years before I stood there in the printing house. It was unlikely that the poet was still alive, but had the poems ever been published? I had an odd, desperate feeling that I should be the steward of this book. At the auction several days later, in a dramatic bid against one other woman, the book and the entire pile it sat on was mine, for a grand total of $7.50. My colleague, Anita Miller, the former director of research at Gannon, used her resources to discover that the poet was William Edward Dimorier, and in the early part of the 20th century he had served as the assistant principal of Academy High School in Erie. With that kernel, the Dimorier Project was launched. The fact that the project had many stops and starts turned out to be a good thing, because as the years progressed, more and more documents became available online. But there came a point about 9 years after the journal's discovery when I had amassed so much research material that I was losing track of what had and hadn't been done yet. By this time, I was working as the director of Penn State's online MBA program, a rewarding position, but I had this nagging feeling that with every hour spent helping our students realize their dreams, I was delaying my own calling. So in September of 2013, I said goodbye to one life and hello to another, fortunate to have the financial and emotional support of my husband, Jim D. Dad, who has proven to be my champion and hero. As I began full-time research, I viewed personnel documents and board minutes at the Erie School District, facilitated by my niece, Andrea Malone. I spent months at the Blasco Library, viewing decades worth of microfilmed out-of-town newspapers through interlibrary loan, in addition to local papers. After I began researching William's life full-time, my findings doubled in size. Reviewing them chronologically, connections were made, and a basic thesis statement was born. Service to others is worthwhile, even if unrecognized. William never received much recognition during his life or after his death, but his influence stretches around the globe and across centuries. From this, it's clear that immediate reward does not always make one's life meaningful. William's life fits closely that described by Robert K. Greenleaf as a servant leader, one who starts with a desire to serve and becomes a leader, rather than the opposite. So now that you know how this whole project got started, I'd like to take you on a tour of Dimorier's life to show you how he fits the servant leader description. Over the last couple of centuries, there has been much confusion as to how to pronounce William's surname, and I'll tell you why I pronounce it the way I do, Dimorier. Not much is known about his early life, but I'll tell you some of what I know. We'll talk about his impressive beginnings as a teacher and a preacher. We'll look at his schooling, which is quite interesting, and then we'll touch on William's early career. William's surname has caused quite a bit of confusion regarding how to pronounce it. Hundreds of years ago in France, it was Dimorier. Over a couple of hundred years, it was changed to Demorest, Dimorier, and finally Dimorier. That last version doesn't seem to fit, and here's why. According to William, one of his ancestors became angry at a brother and wanted his name to be totally different. So he changed the spelling to Dimorier, but everyone still pronounced it Dimorier. William wrote, "This foolish thing has been a great troublemaker, for so few can spell it and fewer can pronounce it." At the Academy class of 1935's reunion in 2005, the attendees didn't recognize William's name as I pronounced it, Dimorier. So I went on to describe his role at the school, and one of them said, "Oh, you mean Mr. Dimorier." Today, most owners of the name pronounce it either as Dimorier or Dimorier, and I've taken to pronouncing it just as written because it's less confusing, at least for me. William Edward Dimorier was born on August 30th, 1871 in Afton, New York, just north of Binghamton and 75 miles north of Scranton, Pennsylvania. America was reconstructing after the Civil War. Homes had no electricity, roads had no automobiles, and the telephone wouldn't be invented for another 5 years. Let's talk about William's family. His parents were Robert and Phoebe Titus Dimorier. He had 3 younger siblings. His father was generally a farmer, but he also took on other jobs as necessary. Over the years, the family crisscrossed the Shenango-Broome County line. The Dimoriers lived among Back Hill folks, a local designation suggesting poverty and ignorance. The family wasn't rich, but they were hardly ignorant. Not much is known about William's early life, except for hints such as what he wrote in an essay years later, as he remembered the pleasure of working in the field with his father by day and of study at evening time with his mother, a former schoolteacher. In his early 20s, William taught school, even though he had not yet earned his high school diploma. In the late 19th century, teachers in the state of New York could earn certification by taking examinations and providing character affidavits. William also started developing a favorable reputation as a Baptist minister. Announcements praising his preaching engagements were often found on the pages of the Afton Enterprise. William was at an age when many men have established their careers and families when he enrolled as an adult high school student at the Afton Union School and Academy. He was elected president of the four-member class of 1897. William graduated high school at the age of 25, and the Afton Enterprise reported that his commencement speech was delivered in his usual forcible manner. The article also announced that William would enter Colgate University that fall. Whether this was a misunderstanding, a misprint, or it was truly William's intent, he'd have to wait 2 more years to do so. So after high school, William spent 2 years at Colgate Academy, which was a prep school for the university. During that time, he served as the pastor of a small Baptist church, and he made monetary contributions to overseas missions. He also served as a guest minister at churches around the area. In 1899, he delivered the Decoration Day address in Afton. The Afton Enterprise reported that he was pursuing a theological degree at Colgate, referring to him by the title of Reverend. It concluded, "Many will hope to hear his voice from pulpit and rostrum in years to come." When William finally entered Colgate University in 1899, he was a decade older than most of the incoming freshmen. This didn't intimidate him, though, and he immersed himself in campus life. He was corresponding secretary for the Colgate YMCA, an officer on the university's athletic advisory board, secretary of the New York State Intercollegiate Athletic Union, and he even joined a fraternity, Phi Gamma Delta. He also continued his preaching, sometimes as many as 80 miles from campus. In 1903, when William graduated from Colgate at the age of 31, it was with a degree in English rather than theology. The reason for this can only be speculated. After graduation, William moved to Penn Yan, New York in the Finger Lakes to teach at Keuka College. After a year teaching English at Keuka College, he spent 2 at Cook Academy, a college prep boarding school for boys in Montour Falls, New York. He also continued to preach at various churches in the area, even being reported as a contender for an open pastorship. Oftentimes, though, his time at the pulpit was spent recruiting for Cook Academy. While at Cook Academy, he jotted a prayer on school stationery, asking for wisdom, fortitude, humility, unselfishness, and Christian courtesy. On the reverse side, he jotted a few other notes, seen here, which contain words that sustained him for his entire life: humility and unselfishness. In the summer of 1906, William began graduate school at Syracuse University and was recruited to a teaching position in Erie, Pennsylvania. He would make Erie his second home for decades, but his family and friends from New York State would always be close to his mind and heart. This would also mark the end of William's preaching career. So far, we've learned that William came from humble beginnings, started leading early, sought an education late, and eventually began a professional career. William was in his mid-30s and 40s during his time at Erie High, also known as Central. We'll talk about his arrival in Erie and his early endeavors. We'll look at the athletic field, now known as Ainsworth Field. We'll see how William brought newspapers and education to Erie, and we'll touch on a period of personal and global loss. In 1906, William arrived in Erie, Pennsylvania, and rented a room in a large duplex on West 6th Street. He was one of at least a half-dozen people boarding in the east side of the building. He would never own a home of his own. His 9-month contract as head of the English department was for $1,007, about 27,000 in today's dollars. The school building, built in 1891 at 10th and Sassafras, was severely overcrowded. It contained both a high school, headed by John C. Deal, and a grammar school run by Charlotte Lucci. William embraced Erie High immediately, taking on the role of treasurer of the school's athletic association. During his second year, he started advising the debate club. He also became an advisor to the yearbook staff and helped launch a new publication which became known as The Spokesman. The Spokesman migrated to Strong Vincent High School when it opened around 1930. Much can be learned about William from Erie High yearbooks, including references that indicate he possessed a dry sense of humor. He also earned a reputation for being a sharp dresser and was apparently the owner of many fancy neckties. This was also when he acquired the nickname Demi. Around this time, William founded a teachers' employment agency, the Erie Teachers Bureau, similar to the one that had placed him at Keuka College. Its office was located on the second floor of Englehart's Hall, which was located just north of the Boston store. In 1911, Carl Fulmer, the Spokesman's alumnus editor attending Dartmouth College, wrote several articles addressing the need for an athletic field. He stated that the students had failed to support previous fundraising campaigns for a field, and therefore the school board had not been convinced of the need for a field. A February 1912 Spokesman article stated that William was hard at work with a committee of prominent businessmen in the city who were at first skeptical, but when the senior class donated their treasury to the project, they were convinced. The school board then appropriated funds, with the students being charged to match its contribution. Fundraising continued, and the Spokesman reported that at a fundraising banquet, Mr. Dimorier, who has worked harder than any other man for the realization of the athletic field, was enthusiastically cheered. In the spring of 1914, the athletic field on 10 acres of land at 24th and Cranberry was ready for use by the track team, including senior Ock Anderson, Erie sports legend in basketball and football, as well as track and field. William recruited Ock Anderson to Colgate University, as well as his younger brother Gus. The baseball field and football field were complete. William was now the faculty advisor to the track team, in addition to the football team advisor. In 1914, the west side of the athletic field was complete. It was expected that the center and east side improvements would be added over time. The 1913 Greater Erie Planning document indicates that the building committee, which included William Dimorier, designed the west side for a grandstand, boys' general playing space, baseball, football, track, and tennis courts. The center was reserved for lawn sports, a plaza, a recreation pavilion, girls' and boys' lockers, and a pool. On the east side, these facilities were anticipated: a boys' gym, croquet, girls' tennis courts and gym, volleyball, handball, and ice hockey. But in 1922, the school board, still dealing with severe overcrowding, approved plans for a new junior high school to be built on the east side of the athletic field property. Today, the property consists of Ainsworth Field for baseball, tennis courts that are no longer in service, and the former Roosevelt Junior High School building, which is for sale. The problem with this is that everyone who contributed to the athletic field fund shared the original vision, and that vision never fully materialized. What if it were possible to restore the area to something like the original plans? With fundraising, corporate sponsorships, and foundation, corporation, and government grants, it could be possible. In 1914, William initiated a project at Erie High which resembled the well-known K-12 newspaper and education program. In the early 20th century, however, the idea was novel, and although William is not the person with whom the idea originated, he is the one who brought it to Erie. An article about William's project was found in the Monroe News-Star in Monroe, Louisiana. It stated that the object of Newspaper Week was to make a kind of laboratory study of the newspaper, its history, essential features, purpose, influence and ideals, combined with practical work by the students in reporting and review writing. William's students wrote to many newspapers around the country requesting copies. The newspapers were displayed around the classroom, and the students learned all about what makes credible and not so credible news. This was at a time when the boys usually read the sports section only, and many girls didn't read the paper at all. The students also heard from professionals in the newspaper business and made presentations themselves on subjects such as the Associated Press. William wrote a paper about the project, and in the coming years it was read at the Pennsylvania State Education Association meeting, and it appeared in the English Journal. Newspaper Week has evolved over the years, and Newspaper and Education, sponsored by the Erie Times News, remains strong in Erie today. In 1916, Erie High was even more crowded than it had been when William first came to Erie 10 years earlier. Serious talks were taking place about the need for an additional high school. Even so, William and Principal John Deal were concerned that many 8th grade graduates were quitting school. So they developed an attendance campaign to address the problem. Upperclassmen visited 8th grade students to talk about the opportunities available at the high school. Superintendent Ira Bush sent letters home advising the 8th graders that they would make a much better living with a high school diploma. Home visits were made to students who hadn't yet signed up for 9th grade. The project resulted in such record enrollment increases in the Erie School District that the project was reported in the American City magazine. The added student population, of course, made an even stronger case for a new high school. From World War I and the Spanish flu pandemic to the death of his parents, 1917-1918 marked a period of loss for William. A good number of William's present and former students went off to fight in the war that did not end all wars, and not all returned. Along with the unthinkable loss of life in the World War, the Spanish flu pandemic killed approximately 5% of the world's population. In 1917, William's father passed away. On file at the Afton Museum is a tattered, undated newspaper clipping, a tribute to Robert Dimorier, most likely written by William. He wrote, "From his lips I have heard the most enchanted story of those hardy days of toil." William had lost his first ever role model. Then, in the summer of 1918, a year after his father's death, William's mother, Phoebe, died. Her obituary detailed how she had come from good Puritan stock and that she had learned several new languages in her advanced years. Another role model. William's time at Erie High was filled with many examples of how he went above and beyond what was expected of him. He stretched his limits by taking on projects such as the athletic field and explored new avenues of teaching, such as Newspaper Week. Now he'd ramp up his servant leadership as he took on even more responsibility. This section covers the period in which William, from the ages of 48 to 68, came into his own as a leader. He was promoted to school counselor at the new Academy High School and shortly thereafter advanced to assistant principal. He also found an altruistic opportunity on the other side of the globe. He led the fundraising for Veterans Memorial Stadium, which remains a landmark today. William played a large part in supporting and guiding music programs at Academy and around the region. He continued his involvement in sports programs and sometimes found himself in the middle of conflict. In 1929, William self-published his own book of poetry. We'll learn how not all of his projects were successful. We'll learn how he loved to travel and he seemed to love children, although he had none of his own. And we'll see how the stroke of a pen ended William's career. Although its cornerstone had been laid in 1917, it wasn't until the fall of 1920 that the new Academy High School building was finally complete. John C. Deal was promoted from principal of Erie High to principal of Academy. 2 counselors for Academy were also appointed, William for the boys and Hattie Schabacker, later Susie Tanner, for the girls. 2 years later, the counselors would be promoted to assistant principals. As a counselor, William had a keen interest in vocational education, and he spent some time at Harvard University's Bureau of Vocational Guidance, where he studied methods of teaching vocational classes and managing vocational programs. In the Academy High yearbook, The Academe, William is listed as the advisor for the new Academy football team. According to John Carney, longtime Erie sports official and author of Saga of Erie Sports, William helped to establish the Academy team's formidable reputation. Carney wrote that Demi should always be remembered as the man who put Erie sports on the map. In early 1921, William's positive influence reached around the world. He received a letter from Gus Nasmith, a fellow Colgate alumnus and Baptist missionary. He was serving as principal of a Christian boys' school in China. William had expressed interest in sponsoring the education of a worthy Chinese student, and Yao Liang, first in his class, might have to leave school to earn money for his family. Nasmith suggested that William contribute $30, about $400 today. So William funded a scholarship for the boy in honor of his mother. This photo of Yao Liang was found at the Afton Museum. At a November 1922 school board meeting, a citizens committee was approved to raise funds for construction of a stadium at Academy High School. This is often written about as the beginning of the stadium project, but there is empirical evidence that William was at work with it as early as 1919. Many fundraising events followed, such as dances, concerts, and festivals. There was even a 3-day horse racing event. Local organizations contributed to the stadium fund, such as the Service Star Mothers, whose children had served or died in the World War. They asked that the stadium be dedicated as a memorial to those who had made the ultimate sacrifice. On November 11, 1924, Veterans Memorial Stadium was dedicated on Armistice Day, which commemorated the World War I peace treaty between the Allies and Germany. This was a fitting occasion for the dedication of a structure designated as a monument to those who fought in the Great War. In front of 15,000 people, after numerous inspiring speeches by civic and military leaders, East beat Central 21-0 for the right to challenge Academy on Thanksgiving Day, November 27th. That game ended in a scoreless tie. Academy's first game in the bowl was actually against Cathedral Prep on November 22nd. That year, the Academy yearbook was dedicated to William for his work on the stadium project. The tribute included the following: "There are grave doubts that this ambition would have been fulfilled if he had not taken the initiative." The stadium has undergone renovations over the years, and although it now seats only 10,000 people instead of 15,000, it reigns as the largest structure for gathering spectators in Erie. Here's a Joseph Plavkin painting depicting the stadium from the Academy High Promenade. I thought it would be especially fitting to share this artwork with you, since Plavkin and his niece, Carol Perry, were the catalysts for the Dimorier project. The painting is housed at the Erie Art Museum. In 1925, William's attention turned to music programs. He brought a music educator to Academy, Morton J. Luvas, a St. Olaf's graduate, who started a school choir. William served as business manager and helped support the choir with his own finances for many years to come. He also began chairing regional musical competitions around this time. In 1926, he began living within walking distance of Academy at the home of Louis and Bertha McGrew. He stayed for 18 years. Louis was superintendent of maintenance for the school district, and Bertha, even though she had no children, served for a time as PTA president for Academy. In 1926, William attended a marching band competition in Illinois and saw how well other communities supported their bands, so he asked the school board for more funds to equip Academy's marching band. The board granted a portion of his request, and he fundraised for the rest. Through William's guidance and management, the choir, which became known as the Academy Singers, performed at the Chicago and New York World's Fairs, sang on nationwide radio multiple times, and even performed at the White House. June Sullivan Dover, class of 1942, was a freshman member of the Academy Singers in 1939 and went on the World's Fair trip that year. In an interview, she said that William seemed lonely, so she invited him to her home for dinner. At first he declined, but eventually he relented and gradually became good friends with the Sullivan family. According to June, William was a soft-spoken man. He always wore a gray three-piece suit, and he had a respectable reputation. With all the references to William as Demi in the yearbooks, one would expect June to have called him by that nickname too, but she did not. That would have been disrespectful. I always called him Mr. Dimorier, she said. October 1927 was an up and down month for William. He was serving as district chairman of Pennsylvania Interscholastic Athletic Association, or PIAA. The month started out great with an exciting football game against Atlanta Tech. Academy warmly welcomed Atlanta at the train station and treated them like royals. John Carney, author of Saga Very Sports, credited William with leading the way for the exciting competition. He wrote that it was one of the first intersectional scholastic games ever played in this country. Atlanta Tech won 7-3, and Erie Dispatch sports writer Jack Kastner reported that although there had been some outbursts in the heat of conflict, the players maintained a pleasant attitude overall. The opposite occurred between fierce football rivals Academy and Jamestown High later in the month. Jamestown fans were accused of harassing Academy fans and other displays of poor sportsmanship. Jamestown denied the claims and accused Academy of sour grapes due to its loss. The incident became big news because William, as athletic advisor, decided not to sign contracts with Jamestown for the following year. Citing affidavits from witnesses, William would not budge when challenged about his decision, but by 1930, the two teams were playing each other once again. At the beginning of 1929, the stock market was trading at an all-time high, and very few could imagine that the economy would soon plunge into the Great Depression. These had been, after all, the Roaring Twenties. June 1929 must have been a rewarding time for William, because this is when he self-published his first book of poetry, The West Wind and Other Verses. The small, soft-cover book was dedicated to his mother and contains 26 poems in fewer than 20 pages. The poems contain classical conventions, scholarly references, and complex themes such as nature, spirituality, morality, fate, and eternity. The flagship poem, The West Wind, reveals William's fascination with the western United States. On October 29, 1929, Wall Street crashed hard, and many people lost their life savings. The Great Depression lasted until 1939, the year William left Academy, and he must have seen hardship in the eyes of many of his students. December 1929 marked a first for William. His original verses were set to music in a composition by his friend Morton Louvas. The piece was called Tiratamba, and the lyrics were set to the tune of an Italian folk song. A few years later, Maryland composer Franz Bornschein used 4 of William's poems in a choral cycle called The Sea. In 1930, William again undertook a major fundraising project. It was not focused on a sports arena this time, but rather on the arts, specifically a pipe organ for the Academy Auditorium. It's interesting that at such a low point in the United States economic history, a single massive musical instrument would receive widespread support from the community. In January 1931, after a year of fundraising, the pipe organ was installed and dedicated. Originally estimated at a price of $6,000, it cost about $12,000, which would be almost $200,000 today. With so much emphasis today on STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, it's amazing to think that long ago a massive project was focused on music education and mere enjoyment. Unfortunately, the way the pipes were installed affected the sound, which was both booming and muffled. By the 1940s, the organ was all but forgotten, and by the late 1950s, it was referred to in an Erie Times article as the $11,645 white elephant. It was eventually dismantled and sold. William traveled extensively throughout the United States and Canada during his life, but not much is known about those trips, except for a few summaries he wrote and letters from friends. He said that in 1 year he traveled 30,000 miles. Much of his time was spent on the West Coast, and this could explain his frequent references to the West Wind in his poetry. In 1930, Morton Louvas, the Academy choir director, took a position at Allegheny College, and recommended Abed Grender, also a St. Olaf alumnus, as his replacement at Academy. William would gain a new friend in Pop Grender, but would also maintain a close friendship with Lubas. In the summer of 1935, William accompanied the Lubas family on a trip out west, a nearly month-long adventure. The late Diane Lubas Larole, daughter of Morton Lubas, recalled the trip in a 2007 phone interview. She was only 5 years old in 1935, but she remembered that she sat on a metal cooler in the back seat of the car between William and her brother Jay. She said, "He was a very gentle man. He was awfully nice and fun to be around. We children just loved him. He had a very gentle voice and always had a sweet look on his face. There was a great deal of affection of mother and dad for him. He was a very, very good friend. I never knew a grandfather, so he was, I suppose, a substitute for me. I called him Demi." William was also a frequent visitor to the home of Pop Grender, and Grender's son Gordon recalled, "He was over for dinner quite frequently. He and Dad got along great. I think Mother felt a little sorry for him because he was a bachelor, and I think he appreciated the chance to have someplace to go once in a while with the family." Gordon's sister Janice added, "I remember him as being rather dapper, wearing a suit with a vest and a fedora hat. I remember feeling that he loved me, and I would sit on his lap when he came to our home." William also seemed to have a good relationship with his niece and nephews back home in Afton, New York. One of his summertime letters to the Erie School District business manager mentions that his paycheck found its way into a fire while he was playing with his niece. The 1939 Academe contained a dedication from William to the seniors. It featured his portrait and the following sentiment: "I wish you much happiness in the morn of life and in the bright afternoon, but above all a clear sky where the sun goes down." It seemed that William knew something was up. In the summer of 1939, William, now 68 years old, took another trip out west. The only evidence of the trip, however, is related to a letter from Superintendent Gross, addressed to William as general delivery in Salt Lake City, Utah. Gross informed William that Pennsylvania's governor had signed a bill permitting the lowering of the mandatory retirement age for school district employees. Gross wrote that he would accept William's retirement effective September 1st, but if William was not in a financial position to retire so soon, he could go on sabbatical at half salary and then retire the following year. William chose the sabbatical option. In June, William had left the school building for summer vacation, and when classes resumed, he was no longer assistant principal. There was no traditional lead-in to his departure, no luxury of a long goodbye, no dinners planned, nor plaques engraved. From this section, we've seen that William's identity was closely associated with his role in the Erie School District. From the stadium to the choir to sports, this was his life, with the exception of the time he spent traveling. In Section 5, which we can call William's second act, we'll see a period of intense productivity with his poetry. He'll produce his magnum opus, or his most important work. He'll display some melancholy, and then he'll be welcomed home. Although retired, William wasn't completely absent from Academy in the early 1940s. The 1941 yearbook mentioned that he was frequently seen in the halls and was still arranging concerts, trips, and making plans for the choir. William had always loved Presque Isle, but now he had more time to spend there. His servant leader qualities were still strong, and an out-of-town newspaper reported him sweeping a sidewalk there. He said that since he used it so much, he might as well maintain it. It's probable that the article refers to the sidewalk trail, which is a cement path the lighthouse keeper used to get to the bay. Here's a photo taken of the sidewalk trail in 2016. It could use some sweeping, don't you think? Although retired, William entered a period of productivity and creativity, writing many new poems in his daybook that he thankfully took the time to date. Sometime in the spring of 1944, William left his daybook of poems at AKD Printing Company in Erie. It's unlikely that he would have intentionally abandoned his daybook. After all, inside the front cover, under his name and address, he offered a reward for its return. Although William was probably saddened at the loss of his book, if this had not occurred, and if his book had not been included in the 2004 auction, he might well have been forgotten in history. From the daybook, most of William's experiences throughout life, including those from his time spent in education, came together in his second self-published book of poetry called Rhymes and Some Reason. From the 70 poems within, which do not include all of those written in the daybook, we can sketch the essence of William E. Dimorier, his early life, his philosophies, his spirituality, and his reflections on all at the end of his days. The Erie School District Superintendent C. Herman Gross, who had delivered the unfortunate retirement news, wrote the preface of the book, stating that William had been a devoted teacher and administrator who went beyond his normal duties. William dedicated his book to members of the armed forces. World War II would wage for another year. In his foreword, William argued that the poems were just reflections of experiences, and he denied any thought that he should be called a poet. These poems, though, show a high level of sophistication, and a short one called Tomorrow is a profound statement on procrastination. Tomorrow by William E. Dimorier. Men dream of a tomorrow that shall never be, an enticing tomorrow none shall ever see. Time reaches for tomorrow in its hungry way. When time o'ertakes tomorrow, lo, it is today. In 1944, 5 years after William went on sabbatical and then retired, he heard that the Erie School District was seeking a counselor for Academy. He wrote to the superintendent offering to do the job for free. He cited his years of experience and wrote, "My head may not be very good, but my heart is in it." And 5 years after his retirement, William was mentioned in the Academe as the father of the choir. Although the war had limited the choir's travel, William was still involved as its business manager. In June 1947, William received a letter from Gus Nasmith, the missionary who had assisted in his sponsorship of a Chinese student in the early 1920s. Nasmith included a church notice which had run in the Shanghai Evening Post and Mercury about a speaker who turned out to be Yao Liang. Liang had become a teacher in the middle school connected with the University of Shanghai. The poor young student William had helped earn an education had become an educator like himself. This is a good example of how the actions of one person can positively affect the outcome of a life far away. In 1947, the facility that had been known simply as the athletic field for more than 30 years was renamed for Doc Ainsworth, the former YMCA coach and physical director who also coached Academy swimming for some time. The athletic field is now known as Ainsworth Field. By 1948, the days William spent in Afton, New York far outweighed those spent in Erie. The 1948 Academe contains no references at all to William. In a letter from William to the superintendent, he wrote in barely legible cursive, slanted on the page, "At this time each year I still long to get back, but time says no. I hope the choir exists in heaven, and that I may be appointed to manage it and take it to the various stars for concerts. Have I overdone this grand statement? Am I foolish in thinking as I do about it?" Looking back on his life, William was appreciative of joyful moments, and the concept recurs often throughout his writing. Here's a poem that appeared in his rhymes book. Joy by William E. Dimorier. I've had deep sorrow, suffered loss, felt pain. I know dark shadows, biting wind, cold rain. I've had rough journeys, hunger pangs, tired feet. I know drear solitude, friendships lost once sweet. But I would welcome and risk life again, for 1 hour of keen joy outdoes pain. On June 14, 1951, William suffered a cerebral hemorrhage and entered Afton Hospital. He passed away several weeks later on July 10, 1951, just shy of his 80th birthday. Several obituaries ran in both Afton and Erie papers. An Afton Enterprise obituary referred to William's love of poetry and claimed that he had memorized more than 600 poems. In the Erie Daily Times, an article announcing William's death ran on the front page and mentioned his contribution to Veterans Stadium and many other accomplishments. In the Afton Museum, a letter was found that William's landlady, Bertha McGrew, with whom he had lived for 18 years, wrote to his sister Mary. Bertha wrote, "I used to tell him that I wished he had married, because when you are old, you appreciate your own home, but he couldn't have had a better one than you gave him. But he used to be so lonesome here at holiday times. He was always glad when school opened." William's poetry indicates that he sometimes reflected on the fact that he never married. His poem, Single Blessedness, which appears only in his daybook, addresses this subject. Single blessedness. It's true I've lived a lonely life, without any child or wife, and yet perhaps it's better, for I've seldom had a family far. The fact that both Ainsworth Field and Veterans Stadium have endured for so many years is a testament to the value of both projects. William was mentioned several times in John Carney's Saga of Erie Sports. In fact, Carney suggested that the Erie Times-News form a committee to create a Hall of Fame for Erie sports. Carney proposed members for the Hall of Fame and included William's name. Today there exists the Metropolitan Erie chapter of the Pennsylvania Sports Hall of Fame, but William's name is not in it yet. Perhaps more important than the sports and structures was William's far-reaching effect on the people he influenced during his lifetime. There were his students, including the earliest students in the one-room schoolhouses where he taught before he even had a high school diploma. There were the many hearts he inspired during his preaching days. Perhaps one or two lives that were headed in the wrong direction were placed back on the straight and narrow after hearing one of William's sermons. There are many more that we will never be aware of, but that's the same with any of us. We never know if the smallest kindness we show to a person we simply pass on the street will make that person's life better, and thereby have a ripple effect that eventually travels around the globe. William devoted his life to service, but why didn't he receive more recognition? Most of the recognition he did receive came from students, not adults. Why was his name never applied to any building or educational program? In a book called The Meaning of Service, which William had in his library, he marked a quotation from Alice Freeman Palmer, second president of Wellesley College. It describes William's legacy very well. She said, "It is people that count. You want to put yourself into people. They touch other people, these, others still, and so you go on working forever." More than a decade after William's death, Robert K. Greenleaf, a retired AT&T executive, wrote the essay The Servant as Leader. He asserted, "The servant leader is servant first. It begins with the natural feeling that one wants to serve first. Then conscious choice brings one to aspire to lead." William led a life of service, and the service itself was paramount compared to accolades. In these times of inflated egos and adoration for billionaire celebrities, we can take a lesson from William E. Dimorier, who fully gave of himself with no expectation of reward. So, to revisit the questions posed at the beginning of this presentation, if you've ever felt insignificant or felt like Sisyphus that you're pushing a rock up the hill over and over just to have it roll down again and again, remember William Dimorier. Don't ever underestimate the effect you have on the world. Thank you for listening to the story of William Edward Dimorier's journey as a servant leader. To learn more about the Dimorier Project, please visit AnnSilverthorne.com.